Hey, it's Dr. Scott again. Hey, just wanted to share a tip with you. So we talk in our workshops, the Perfect Storm workshops, we do a lot about this concept of this thing they call a developmental diastasis. And if you've never heard this term before, and probably most people wouldn't have, it's an important thing why we see the kind of results that we do. So in a research study that was done by the Sam Wang out of Princeton, one of the things that he found is in a population they were studying of kids that were diagnosed with autism. They said they had this birth process induced developmental diastasis. And so in essence, right, the term diaschisis essentially means shock. It means that there is a shock to the nervous system that disrupts input to the brain, right? Well, what they found is that the birth process was the trigger for the children that in this study later on developed autism because of disruptions in input from a part of the brain called the cerebellum. Well, the story, what you have to understand is that the birth process can be very traumatic. In this case here, they found that kids who had a cesarean section delivery were significantly more likely to later on be diagnosed with autism because the force of a C-section is greater than other types of birth processes. Not that other types of birth processes are not without force, but in a standard C-section, the amount of force they use on a baby's neck can range from as low as 40 pounds to up to 80 pounds with just manual extraction. If they put in a vacuum extractor, that force can peak well over 100 pounds of force going into a little baby's very, very weak cervical spine. And so what it does, it creates what they call subpathological injury. It doesn't tear or break tissues, but what it does is it disrupts all the communication from the sensory input coming into the brain, and it creates a shock. The cerebellum requires input constantly. And so when that occurs then, there is such a disruption in a child who later on ends up being diagnosed with autism that it literally disrupted the pathways of the information from the cerebellum up to the prefrontal cortex to drive personality, sensory, motor, speech development, all of those things. And so one of the reasons why we get such changes in children that are on the spectrum and kids with other types of sensory and ADHD issues and so on is because if you get rid of what is causing the shock, you normalize the input to the cerebellum, the brain is always able to rewire itself. So they call this process neuroplasticity. If you can start to normalize the sensory input, the brain can begin to refire and rewire, work its way backwards through the shock. That's why you see so many kids in the practice that have had a number of different challenges coming in, but we see these consistent overtime improvements in their function because we remove that interference that created the shock. And so if you see a lot of the kids who come in here on the spectrum, right, one of the things if you ask their parents is that the biggest things that they notice early is they're calmer, right, because they're not getting so much of the background noise, the shock to the nervous system that's been there for so long. But what they see over the long term is this progressive improvement in intellect and function and speech and sensory and autonomic function. Because now the brain is able to refire itself and rewire itself and begin to truly heal because it's finally for the first time getting proper sensory input so the brain can go through and do what we need it to do. Refire, rewire, and heal. Hope this was helpful. Hopefully this answers some questions. If this created some new questions for you, do not hesitate to bring this to myself, Dr. Brandon, Dr. Lena. We are all happy to help you with answering any questions you might have because I know when you start hearing some of these things, many of us will begin to think about friends or loved ones. So we're happy to help you with questions about that because our ultimate mission with all of these things that we're doing is to help and to serve. I look forward to seeing you at your next visit. Have a great day.